annual Digital Humanities Conference. We're delighted that so many members of ACH still participate in the Alliance Digital Humanities organizations and their conference. We're also equally as delighted to now be in the 5th year of running fourth year of running our own conference. In 2019, we were delighted to host a conference in person in Pittsburgh. We had intended for a conference in person in Houston in 2021, but there were pandemic related issues. Instead, we've run virtual conferences since 2021. And I know that when I turn this over to our conference lead and program committee leads, Pam Lack and Liz Grumbach, they will say more about virtual conferences. But through our virtual conferences, we have seen our community grow at ACH. We've seen such diversity in the kinds of fields of study and methods and job roles of people who are attending our conference, and are just delighted that you've stuck with us and are part of the ACH community. Before I turn this over to Pam and Liz, I would like to thank the ACH 2023 organizers, conference chair Pamela Lack, program committee lead Liz Grumbach, platform committee co-leads Alex Romer-Colan and Andy Janko, conference committee members Caitlin Pollack, Eduardo Arriaga, and Sarah Potvin, and also a thank you to 2 of our officers, Jawan Wu, our ACH communications officer, and Amanda Visconti, our ACH secretary, who've done a lot of behind the scenes, unsung work for the organization more generally, and also for this conference. And as one of the people who is very involved in running the conference prior to this year, I just want to acknowledge the way that these folks stepped up and brought such kindness and generosity and care and thoughtfulness to the organization of the conference, and that you're all getting to experience now. So thank you so much for your work and for helping me feel like there's a future for this conference that doesn't involve me organizing it. We would like to thank all of our peer reviewers for participating in constructing the program by doing your reviews and doing your reviews on time. Your contributions helped shape the program, and we really appreciate your generosity and your time, and also the care that you put into the review process. I'd like to thank all the volunteers who are serving as moderators, as technical chairs, making sure we ensure safety online on our Zooms. Thank you as well to those who've agreed to be the guides in Work Adventure, where our poster session and our installation sessions will be held on Saturday. Congratulations to the bursary winners. We are delighted that we were able to give out free conference registration for graduate students and contingent on or underemployed colleagues, and that who are members of ACH. That was the only caveat, members of ACH and presenting at the conference. So we're pleased to support your participation. Thank you for being part of our community. And also we were able to fund everybody who applied. which is always, always delightful. Another thank you to Ithaca. Ithaca has sponsored Work Adventure, which is the virtual world that we're using for the poster session, installation sessions on Saturday. Amy Kirchhoff, who is a senior manager for Constellate, will be providing presentations and one-to-one demos for Constellate, their new text analysis tool. With Constellate, you can teach, learn, and perform text analysis with scholarly and primary source content from JSTOR, Portico, and Partners. More information about Constellate, Constellate's Text Analysis Pedagogy Institute, and when and how to access Constellate demos during our conference, please visit our website at ach2023.ach.org/en/sponsor. I want to remind you to please not miss our AGM, the ACH Annual General Meeting, which takes place today at 1:45 p.m. We hope you'll join us to learn more about the last year of work that the ACH Executive Council has been doing. We'll talk about the future of the ACH conference and also our new working groups. You can also ask questions about ACH and share your feedback on directions of the organization. And you can find the Zoom link on our schedule. Now I'm delighted to turn the program over for our wonderful keynote session. I'm very excited about our speakers and our moderators. So I'm going to turn this over to Pamela Lack and Liz Grumbach.
Thank you so much, Roopsie, for getting us started this morning or this afternoon, depending on where y'all are. I'm Pam Lack. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the conference chair for ACH 2023, and it is my extreme pleasure to welcome you all here today. This conference represents the culmination of the hard work, care, and dedication of our planning team, myself, Liz Grumbach, Andy Jenko, Alex Wormer-Colin, Caitlin Pollock, Sarah Potvin, and Eduard Arriaga. Since October, our little team has worked tirelessly to make these 3 days possible. We're especially grateful to our ACH co-presidents, Rupika Rassam and Quinn Dombrowski, as well as all of the officers and the entire Executive Council for supporting our efforts, answering our many questions, and cheering us on. We're also thankful of the many individuals who volunteered their time and energy as peer reviewers, session moderators, technical chairs, and virtual world guides. I'm going to turn things over to our ACH program chair, Liz Grumbach. But before I do that, I just want to say how incredible it's been collaborating with Liz this last year. Liz is a model of care and generosity and collaboration. It's been such a joy working with her, and I've learned so much from her, how to be a more caring and humane human being, and how to let go a little bit, trust a little bit more, and know that we were going to put together a really amazing conference. So with that, I'll turn it over to Liz.
I can only come on and immediately thank my colleague, Pam. It has been one of the best parts of my year and maybe my career to work on this conference committee and with the ACH executive board. Our success is so much because of the work of Roopsie to document and make visible the work and labor of conference organizing. But I have to especially thank Pam for her grace, her generosity, the way she holds space for others to feel seen and heard. This conference's commitments to justice and care are things that we inherited as a committee, but it was Pam's everyday labor that infused all of our conference experiences with care for self and for others and care that we make this conference centered on inclusivity, bravery, and compassion. So thank you, dear friends and colleagues. So now we want to take a moment to reflect on our intentions in hosting a virtual conference, particularly at a time when so many conferences have returned to in-person. We recognize that not all members of our community are able to or want to return to the old conference model. Physical conferences are not without their costs, whether environmental or financial, or their risks to our health, privacy, safety, and well-being. We choose to remember the lessons from the past 3 years as we continue reimagining ways of being in community together that are caring, generative, non-extractive, equitable, and inclusive. In gathering virtually, we acknowledge what has been lost in the last 3 years, and we strive to protect each other from the precarity of our current times. We refuse to go back to an imagined pre-pandemic normal where our most vulnerable were excluded from full participation in social and scholarly worlds. Perhaps it is no surprise then that the conference committee chose accessibility and digital scholarship as the theme for our opening keynote conversation. In selecting this theme, we note how questions of accessibility and disability rights intersect and align with countless movements for social justice. Our work as digital humanists holds the possibility for thoughtful and intentional advocacy for greater accessibility. Yet too often we find ourselves using tools that are inaccessible or expose us to risk, whether out of choice or necessity. We hope that this conversation sparks new ways of thinking about accessibility across digital scholarship. And we invite you to reflect on new ways of framing and formulating your work over the next 3 days and beyond. And with that, I will turn it back over to Pam to introduce our keynote conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. Our keynote conversation will be moderated by Caitlin Pollock and Marisol Fila. Caitlin Pollock is the Digital Scholarship Specialist for University of Michigan Library, where she works with students and faculty on digital scholarship workshops, projects, and initiatives. Her work consists of coordinating workshops and public programming and leading the library's online exhibits program and text and data mining services. She holds a Master of Science in Library and Information Science from Pratt Institute and a Master of Arts in Digital Humanities from Loyola University, Chicago. Her research interests include Black digital humanities, Black women librarian history, humanities data, and DIY making pedagogy. Marisol Fila is a PhD candidate in Romance Languages and Literatures, Spanish and Portuguese, at the University of Michigan. Her dissertation explores how Black female and male writers, artists, and intellectuals in the 21st century Black presses of Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Lisbon use digital and print media to navigate distinct articulations between diasporic and national Black identities. Marisol is also interested in critical pedagogy and public digital humanities and developing digital projects in partnership with Afro-descendant organizations across Portuguese and Spanish-speaking countries. Marisol is the recipient of a University of Michigan 2022 Anti-Racism Research Grant and a current Imagining America page co-director. And with that, I will turn it over to Marisol and Caitlin.
Thank you, Pam, for that lovely introduction.
Thank you so much.
Yes. I'm just gonna pull up our notes and get started. We are going to introduce our speakers, and Marisol and I have split the speaker introduction duty. And so I will be introducing Jasmine Clark, our first speaker. Jasmine Clark is the Digital Scholarship Librarian at Temple University. Her primary areas of research are accessibility and metadata in emerging technology centers. Currently, she's leading the Virtual Blackson, a project to recreate and gamify the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American collection in virtual reality to teach high school students primary literacy skills. She's also doing research in 3D metadata and accessibility guidelines for virtual reality experiences. She is also the chair of the DLF Digital Accessibility Working Group, as well as the co-chair of the DLF Committee for Equity and Inclusion. Jasmine has experience in a variety of functional areas and departments, including metadata, archives, digital scholarship, and communications and development. She is interested in the ways information organizations can integrate accessible, inclusive practices into their services, hiring, and management practices.
Can everybody hear me? You all hear me? Wonderful. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, Caitlin. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get these slides up on. Let's see. Wonderful. And can everyone see my first slide here? Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. As the title suggests, as Caitlin's introduction has suggested, I'm going to be talking about virtual reality, yes, kind of as a venue to talk about the importance of accessibility, particularly in public DH efforts. So it seems like I'm really in accessibility and doing all this, but I had no previous background, not any formal background, but beyond like basic legal understanding and some basic technical understanding before I became a digital scholarship or a resident librarian at Temple University in 2017. We at Temple University, you get to do 3 rotations, so through 3 different departments. And out of all of the departments, digital scholarship was something I knew the least about. And out of all of the technologies, virtual reality was what I knew the least about. I knew it was emerging, I knew it was becoming increasingly popular, but I had a specific interest in it. I had kind of a background in urban education for Black students. Philadelphia is a city that is roughly 50% Black. The school district is actually a higher percentage in Black students than the city overall. One thing that research shows is multimodality is effective, in particular for Black students due to cultural and environmental factors. So I was interested as an archivist in thinking about primary source literacy for reasons I'll get into later. And then of course the multisensory component of the VR experience. I knew immediately that I wanted to work with the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American collection. The responsibility for preserving the record of our history is a weighty and important one indeed. I accepted it years ago for the long distance runners of Black bibliophilia, who will one day pass the baton to the next generation of runners after a distance arduously but lovingly and rewardingly won. This is Dr. Blockson. I felt it was particularly important to include him in the slideshow. He actually passed away this past week. And he is actually the founder of the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American collection. When he was 9 years old, growing up in Norristown, which is a suburb of the Philadelphia area, he asked his teacher what Negroes had contributed to history, and she said Negroes have no history. This led him to a lifelong path of collecting. materials that resulted in 1984 in him donating a huge part of his personal collection. Some of it is at Penn State, a huge chunk of it is at Temple. Of rare publications and artifacts related to African-American history, as well as the diaspora. It is not actually just an Afro-American collection. They have a huge amount of materials from the diaspora as a whole, and the continent. And part of the reason he selected Temple University, if you're not familiar with Temple's location, it is located in North Philadelphia, which is one of the Blackest, but also most economically depressed areas of the city. So he wanted actual Black people from the community to be able to access this collection to combat the erasure that he had faced and that we still face in a lot of ways. These critical race theory laws are not, about critical race theory. It is now one of the nation's leading facilities for the study of the history and culture of people of African descent. It consists of over 700,000 items from the global Black experience and contains a ton of different formats. You've got museum objects, so that's like statues, portraits, but you also have manuscripts, photographs, audio recordings. We have some medallions from Tupac from the Tupac collection. So it is truly a collection that consists of a variety of materials. And then of course, as I already said, it exists to rectify this erasure that we face as Black. So let's get to the virtual component very briefly. Here you can see to the left is a screenshot from the actual recreation, actually really early version of the recreation of the reading room in virtual reality. To the right is actually our developer, Jordan Hamble. He's in the physical reading room. You can see the kind of correspondence, the similarities between the two. And he's actually engaging in photographs for photogrammetry. So you can't see it. There's a museum object on the table in the lighting center on a turntable, and he's taking photographs from every angle that we can run through Agisoft Metashape. I forget, they updated their name. It's Agisoft to create 3D models via photogrammetry. Let's briefly talk about the pedagogical approach of the virtual Blockson. While free and open to everyone, the game is actually designed for high school students and is currently focused on the Philadelphia area just for our prototype and user testing. Philadelphia schools are 53%. These are a year, I check every year, this slide is from last year, are 53% Black, roughly 22% Latinx, largely from the Caribbean, meaning still heavily related of African descent, 13% white, 7% Asian, and then 5% multiracial other. Once again, a huge portion of Black and Native American mixed there. Well, not huge, but largely Black mixed multiracial individuals. And this will be in line with Common Core standards. We're working with actually the whole team, but we are working with faculty in the College of Education here who Tim Patterson has a background in social studies and public history for the high school age. This will consist of multiple game levels that follow under different categories or of Black life. And it will adhere to the SAA, AACRL, RBMS guidelines for primary source literacy. Sorry for anyone that's not familiar with those organizations. SAA is the Society for American Archivists. ACRL is the Association of College and Research Libraries. And the rare books manuscript section, that's what RBMS is. So they focus on rare books and manuscripts. Those guidelines articulate the range of knowledge, skills, and abilities required to effectively use primary sources. Primary source literacy is defined as the combination of knowledge and skills and abilities necessary to effectively find, interpret, evaluate, and ethically use primary sources within specific disciplinary contexts. And also to be able to reinterpret that knowledge to create new knowledge. So I know this all sounds like very high level, but the sum of it is in line with Blockson's mission. A lot of Black students in the Philadelphia School District don't have access to a library. There are 15 for all, they just closed a bunch of schools, 200 something schools, and more of them are closed. The libraries are run by volunteers, and students are not necessarily gaining, nonetheless, library information on how to search and do reference research in a library, but nonetheless primary source. And this is a huge barrier to Black students having agency in writing, interrogating, and otherwise further engaging with their own history. So this prototype that we're building right now is focused on Black art of the 1940s. It focuses on Doc Thrash and Laura Willow Waring. Our team consists of a graduate student from the Anthropology department, and it's not just Smith who's actually presenting today as well as a number of other people helping out with the game design and research components. And this was also focusing on the Pyramid Club, which is a local Black middle class social club that had annual art exhibits. So this is like when we talk about disciplinary knowledge, we're starting with art history because that's kind of my background. But the idea is that we would expand into other types of primary source research, because scientific research, like historical research versus architecture versus fine art, are very different disciplines with different types and skills associated with primary source research. And we want these students to kind of learn these skills and be able to actually assert whether they're, the other thing is primary source research focuses on undergraduate students heavily. We want community members to learn these skills, not just those in undergrad for obvious financial structural barrier reasons. Getting into structural barriers, systemic problems. Let's talk about disability in the United States. Let's do like a bit of a pivot. The 26% of adults in the US have a disability. That's 61 million people. And this number is from the CDC. It is a little old, but it holds true, though with certain medical conditions that may be worse. Women and minorities have higher rates of disability. Rates also increase with age, and it's closely intertwined with poverty. If you get into ethnicity, American Indian / Alaska Natives have a 3 in 10 have disability, despite being a very small percentage of the population. The same thing goes for Black Americans. 1 in 4 have a disability, despite only composing like 12 to 13% of the population. Marginalized groups have a history of being medicalized to justify discrimination. This includes things like drapetomania, I'm sorry for the interpreters, which is a made-up condition from the 19th century that said enslaved Africans and Black people who wanted to flee from enslavement had a mental disease. Why would they want to be free? But there's also being disabled due to unequal access to resources. So that's why these populations have particularly high rates. They don't have equal access to medical care. They live in food deserts, so nutrition isn't there. They may not have access to fancy gyms and personal trainers to make sure that their fitness levels are maintained. All of these things come together to increase rates of disability in these communities. And this ties into the public effort for digital humanities, because if you're producing for these communities, you need to keep in mind that you cannot further marginalize them by discriminating subsections of these populations by making your materials inaccessible. I'm gonna go through these a little faster to respect time. Let's get into some definitions. There are really 3 major definitions of disability. You have the legal definition, which factors, according to ADA, factors in major life activities like working, taking care of yourself, record of disability, i.e. having some sort of like history or medical diagnosis, and then being regarded as having a disability. So if you are on the spectrum and you have a sensory sensitivity, but you can do your job fine, but suddenly they implement a new rule that requires that you engage with a software that uses sounds that you can't function with, and you suddenly become unable to do the job, and they will not accommodate you. You are now being regarded as having a disability. You have been disabled. So even if you were totally functional every other way, if you're being treated as such, ADA considers that as well. The social model views disability from a functional perspective. It's not that you are disabled, it's that society is excluding you, which disables you. And then there's the medical model, which is what a lot of people are more familiar with, which is, you've been medically diagnosed as having a disability, and that needs to be cured or treated. Let's talk about who's included in disability. This is a really helpful model that talks about the kind of division between permanent, temporary, and situational disability. Permanent is I have lost an arm, that's not coming back. Temporary is I broke my arm, it will heal up at time. And situational is I just gave birth to a newborn and I at different times cannot use one of my arms. it is important when you're designing that you also remember that you're not just talking about blind. That's it. If you're blind, do you have people who are lower vision who maybe need to be able to zoom in and see something, or people who maybe, that's why they say daytime television exists, right? Moms who are busy taking care of kids and cooking and cleaning needed to be able to listen to something, and it's very dynamic. And also you don't have to have an attention span, a certain degree of attention span to do it. So when you're designing for users, think about like the spectrum of when disabilities kick in. There's the ethical and structural considerations of all of this. Accessibility is a human right. Disabled people are people. They have a right to safety and leisure. There's also accessibility as a civil right. Disabled people have rights as citizens that they fought for. This is not a charity. Nobody is being nice to disabled people with ADA. They have had sit-ins and a whole civil rights movement of their own. And ADA is civil legalization that enforces those civil rights, right? They should have the ability to vote, to work, to participate in society, and to dictate the direction society takes in a democratic society. Accessibility is a form of innovation. These design benefits, creative design benefits everyone. And when we build to be inclusive, unique, and using thorough and sustainable practices, more people can contribute to the, I hate this phrase, but to the marketplace of ideas. And more voices mean more unique and innovative developments. I'm just including this link, but mandates are one thing, execution is another. When you bring up these issues, people say what ADA exists. If you go to the Office of Civil Rights, they actually list all of the pending cases under investigation. And if you look at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary schools, there's always hundreds and hundreds of cases for different types of discrimination. You can see it for yourself that that law does not need adherence. This is not, I want to be respectful of time, so I'm going to kind of go through this. We did user testing for VR. When I learned all this, I said, hey, what does VR accessibility look like? It didn't exist at the time, really. We brought in users who were blind and deaf, and we did user testing with VR, and not just on the technology, but also our services and the way we structured our department. While I did all of that, one-offs wouldn't fix inaccessibility. I would have to change the way we functioned. So I began training staff, rewriting policy, working with my colleagues to do so, and working with colleagues to standardize these new workflows to train everybody and get everyone on the same page. And I identified 5 steps necessary to implementing accessibility. You'll need standards. If there's no rules people follow, they can't follow them. You'll have to audit everything according to those standards to see where things are. You'll have to remediate and design resources, i.e. fix them if they're not accessible. You have to standardize and streamline those practices. That means educating and training staff and setting approved tools and platforms. So that way in the future, people can adhere, not reinventing the wheel. You'll have to document all of the practices so that people can see what you did, why you did it, and make revisions accordingly. This requires appropriate tested standards, dedicated specialized staff. I mean, if you all aren't trained on accessibility, somebody has to be. Time and money, long-term maintenance and funding. Yeah, all of that has to be in place to actually sustain accessibility so that you don't build something accessible and it's just broken the next day. If you go into a Mecca and you're like, oh, Mecca's accessible, but you upload a bunch of inaccessible materials, then that doesn't fix it, right? Let's talk about the current state of many cultural heritage / educational institutions. Many are reliant on postdocs, transient, or underpaid labor. That included myself, right? I was a resident. I was done in 2 years. So I did all this research to kind of address our inaccessibility. If I had not been kept, that would have been gone. Many leave before expertise can even fully be developed. I've been at Temple for years now. I've been able to really dedicate myself to increasing my expertise. And many are already dealing with scope creep and have too much on their plate. I love my job. I do like 2-3 different jobs. And that's not just me, that's everybody in a lot of places. Many are running relatively small staff. They are busy aiding scholars, researchers, students, and public patrons, or doing their own research, making purchases and maintaining the space, completing other day functions. That goes for if you're an instructor, you're teaching, researching, writing grants. In higher education, the emphasis is often on the latest technology. I just wrote an article about this, technocratic innovation, where you have this idea of you have to have fast turnover rates in technology. because the newest is here and you don't want to fall behind, but that can hinder standard development. And the nature of tech culture is so innovative and it solves inconveniences rather than actually deconstructing underlying problems. So you tend to just keep bad practices going at a very fast pace. So what needs to be done? You're going to have to budget for accessibility when establishing services or planning projects. You're going to have to plan for long-term staff as well as fund to train those staff, as well as providing accessibility support to patrons if you are working in a library context, and students if you're an instructor. Innovation and competition can't be an excuse for poor design and incomplete work, and you're going to need to hire disabled people. That's like the short of it. That's my time. Thank you all for coming today. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. There's a lot to talk about in the Q&A portion. So we can move forward. I am going to introduce our second panelist, and I'm going to introduce Remy Yergau. They, them, theirs is an Arthur F. Thurno Associate Professor of Digital Studies and English at the University of Michigan. They currently direct the Digital Accessible Futures Lab as part of the DISCO network, which receives funding support from Mellon Foundation. Remy's scholarly interests include rhetoric and communication, digital studies, queer rhetorics, disability studies, and neurodiversity. Their book, Authoring Autism on Rhetoric and Neurological Queerness by Duke University Press, is a winner of the 2017 MLA First Book Prize, the 2019 CCCC Lavender Rhetorics Book Award for Excellence in Queer Scholarship, and the 2019 Rhetoric Society of America Book Award. They are currently at work on a second book project tentatively titled Crypt Data. In their spare time, they obsess over the Electric Light Orchestra. Thank you very much, Remy, for coming today, and we look forward to hearing you as well.
Hi, this is Remy speaking. Thank you, Marisol, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank Jasmine for getting the conversation started, as well as Liz, Pam, and Caitlin for organizing this session this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'll have some slides in the background, and most of my slides are key terms, but I will pause and describe slides that have images. In the chat, I also posted a link to a Google Drive folder, which contains a script as well as the slides for the talk today. So please feel free to follow along via the script. I'm going to stick pretty closely to it, but I will skip parts due to time constraints. So I'm going to talk briefly on a few points that may at first seem quite distinct. I plan to talk about autos, A-U-T-O-S, which is Greek for self, sense of independence, in relation to 3 examples relating to disability and technology. First, autism and generative AI. Second, autism and the anti-trans internet. And third, automation and accessibility. So here's the first one. I'm going to talk a bit about cultural constructions of autism and how these constructions feed into discourse on generative AI. Autism's very namesake is derived from the Greek term autos, referencing the supposedly self-focused propensities of children diagnosed with the condition. As Bonnie Evans, E-V-A-N-S, notes, over time, autism morphed from referring to the so-called inner hallucinatory lives of children with schizophrenia to being conceptualized as the exact opposite, as the lack of having any inner symbolic life at all. So in this way, autism has really long been understood as being a deficit in selfhood. Even present day corporate charities like Autism Speaks, which is much reviled among autistic folks, represent autistic people as being utterly alone trapped within themselves. And on the slide is a screenshot of the website Missing, which is Autism Speaks' joint genomic research initiative with Google. And of note, Missing is completely missing the letter I in its spelling, which is a not subtle reference to what autistic people supposedly lack. One staying theory concerning the etiology of autistic aloofness is the idea that autistic people have impairments in what is called theory of mind. And no. Basically, theory of mind is the ability to recognize that other people have their own unique mental states, feelings, and perspectives. And when it comes to autism, many clinicians presume that a defining feature of autistic life is the failure to recognize others, the failure to understand that other people have their own thoughts that differ from yours. More than this, autistic people are typically represented as not only misunderstanding others, we're often positioned as not even fully understanding our own selves. So we lack not only a theory of other people's minds, but our own minds too. Why does this matter to our conversation today? Because artificial intelligence research discursively positions AI as autistic. AI has no theory of other minds, as it were. When you use ChatGPT, it doesn't know that you exist outside of itself, nor does it arguably recognize itself as a self. In the many conversations, both popular and academic, that have dotted the generative AI landscape, we are frequently greeted with descriptions of generative AI's limitations. Descriptions that defer to words like parroting or hallucinating to do the supposedly critical work of identifying what is AI. And these words, it must be noted, are disability-specific words. Disability-specific words that hail directly from the clinical histories and presence of conditions like autism and schizophrenia. These words, it should also be noted, hail from longer histories in which human minds are understood in mechanical terms, as having computational capacities that supposedly range from order to disorder. Uta Frith, whose last name is spelled F-R-I-T-H, and her co-authors in 1994 famously described autistic people who passed theory of mind tests as hacking the tests. In order to measure autistic children's theory of mind capacities, Frith and her co-authors used false belief tasks. So one version of these false belief tasks was the so-called Smarties test. Here, the examiners would give the child a tube of Smarties, which is chocolate candies for those not in the know, and ask what the child was inside the tube. Upon the child saying that the tube had Smarties in it, the examiners would then reveal that the tube held pencils rather than candy. And on the screen, I've got a tube of Smarties and now a pencil poking at the tube of Smarties. Then, the examiners would ask the child to guess what another kid would think was inside the tube if they were just walking into the room. If the child were to respond a pencil rather than Smarties, they would fail the theory of mind task. So to the examiners, pencil served as confirmation that the child had no concept of another person's perspective. Saying pencil means that you can't conceive another person's reality, or the fact that they would have no awareness that there might be a pencil rather than Smarties in the tube. So the problem with the Smarties test, you may wonder, some autistic kids actually gave the correct answer, Smarties. In other words, some of the autistic kids in the study passed the theory of mind test. Among the authors' hypotheses for this result was that the autistic kids may have, quote unquote, hacked the test by using non-theory of mind strategies, such as language ability. Hacking, in other words, represents a kind of passing or even parroting. It's the ability to game or mimic social conventions without real understanding. And the use of the term parroting in particular also draws from scholarship on the speech patterns of autistic and other neurodivergent youth. Parroting often serves as a reference to echolalia, or repetitive speech. Behavioral scholarship has frequently described autistic and schizophrenic speech patterns as being mechanical. as lacking motivation or meaning, and as being attempts at social communication made through simulated action. Researchers have also pejoratively described schizophrenic people's experiences of psychosis as an over-attribution of other people's mental states. Paranoia in these examples is represented as imagining others' mental states, beliefs, and intentions where they may not exist. So we encounter this discourse on hallucinating, parroting, hacking, simulating language, and theory of mind quite frequently in the current wave of discourse on generative AI. I am thinking in particular here of the important work that Emily Bender, B-E-N-D-E-R, Timnit Gebru, G-E-B-R-U, Angelina McMillan-Major, MCMILLAN-MAJOR, and Schmargret Schmitchell, SHMITCHELL, have done in proffering critiques of generative AI and natural language processing. So their work is especially crucial for its identification of how bias becomes encoded in mechanic modes of languaging, and how language learning models both draw from harmful white supremacist sources and bear the real potential to perpetrate harm. Others, such as Naomi Klein, K-L-E-I-N, have focused on the ways in which tech industry discourse on AI hallucination obscures larger conversations concerning climate change and the violences wrought by late-stage capitalism. Klein even goes so far as to claim that tech CEOs are themselves hallucinating. So my main purpose here isn't to critique Klein or Bender et al.'s larger and more important aims, which are grounded in imagining more just futures. Rather, I want to identify how the unfolding rhetorics of stochastic parrots and hallucination, which have permeated the discussion of generative AI far and wide, rely on autism and schizophrenia as communicative foils. Notably, Bender et al.'s focus on large language models, however unintentionally, mirrors clinical discourse on language hacking and neurodivergent under and over attribution of mental states. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of passages from their article. So take, for example, the following. Language models are not performing natural language understanding and only have success in tasks that can be approached by manipulating linguistic form. In other words, hacking. And later, when the authors note that text generated by a language model is not grounded in communicative intent, any model of the world, or any model of the reader's state of mind, which in a nutshell is theory of mind. So to be clear, this is the kind of language used to describe and often used to denigrate neurodivergent people's ways of communicating and interrelating. And as we might recall from the earlier discussion on theory of mind and hacking, language ability often serves as a clinical marker for supposedly passing as human while not fully bearing the cognitive capacities for being fully considered human or being fully considered communicative. So I'm going to make a really stark transition now. I want to talk about anti-trans rhetoric on Twitter and its use of autism to support its nefarious aims. So in turning to anti-trans discourse, I'm once again summoning the autos foil, wherein autism becomes a stand-in for lacking intimate knowledge of oneself and others. A variety of academic studies, in concert with anecdotal accounts from autistic community spaces, have observed that a higher proportion of autistic people are transgender than are non-autistic people. A 2020 study in particular found that trans and non-binary folks are 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic, and estimated that anywhere from 3 to 9% of trans folks might be autistic. In relating findings from clinical research that engages the intersections of neurodivergence and gender identity, I want to highlight 2 things. So first, these studies often hypothesize that theory of mind deficits and hormonal imbalances may cause autistic people to gravitate toward transness, thus rendering gender nonconformity as an autism symptom. One of the co-authors in the 2020 study I just mentioned, Simon Baron-Cohen, whose last name is Baron-Cohen, has been notorious in this regard. Much of his life's work centers around the claim that autistic people possess a so-called extreme male brain, and that our supposed extreme maleness prevents us from fully accounting for the mental states of others and ourselves. And researchers who forward these hypotheses are often obsessed with gender diverse autistics who were assigned female at birth. They understand autistic trans men as proving their theory, while autistic trans women provide them more opportunity to think about autistic mental hacking. Second, TERFs, which is shorthand for trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs eat this up. They flock to social media to proclaim that trans adults are preying on autistic girls and converting them to transhood. And I want to quickly note that Baron-Cohen, who I cited a second ago, is not at all neutral in this. He blurbed Deborah Soh's, S-O-H, The End of Gender, which is an anti-trans book that recycles this egregious commentary that neurodivergent kids mistakenly believe they're trans because they're disabled. So Twitter, as many of you know, has become an especially hospitable place for anti-trans sentiment. And the construct of autistic kids as being socially vulnerable and out of tune with normative selfhood provides endless fodder for those who claim that trans kids don't exist. The clinical formation of autos as turning inward proves an attractive commonplace for a whole host of anti-trans actors, self-declared gendered critical feminists, alt-right agitators, white supremacists, and resistant parents. Elon Musk, M-U-S-K, frequently leverages his own autistic status to amplify anti-trans commentary that draws upon autistic impairment to sustain its arguments. In addition to claiming that cisgender is a slur, Musk has tweet quoted articles on quote unquote gender ideology to claim that, quote, kids who are same-sex attracted and or autistic are the most vulnerable, end quote. And I'll note I'm purposefully not showing the tweets here because I just don't want to give them traffic. Musk has also reaffirmed other users' sentiments that autistic kids are the, quote, largest class of children targeted by the trans agenda, end quote. And in like kind, he has circulated an array of anti-trans memes, including one of Elliot Page, in which Page's Protect Trans Kid shirt had been photoshopped to read, sterilize autistic kids. So I'm drawing attention to anti-trans Twitter discourse, in part to show how the discourse around neurodivergent modes of intimacy and relation is never neutral. In recirculating tropes around mentalistic impairment, linguistic hacking, hallucinating, and parroting, we provide sustaining power to those who wish harm upon the most vulnerable. Parroting has also become a kind of anti-trans speak for those who insist a so-called trans agenda is brainwashing disabled children, much like parroting has become one among many disability-imbued ways of discussing what ails AI. So here is where I'm going to close. I want to end with a very brief meditation on a different kind of autos, the question of automating access. And I'm going to cut myself short here, if only because I think our ensuing collective conversation will provide more opportunity for group reflection. In my daily life, as someone who needs, uses, and receives varying and often insufficient levels of disability accommodation at work, I have been struck by my own internalization of autos rhetorics in my institutional advocacy work on disability accommodations. As with many universities, my university is resistant to providing supports, often delaying or denying needs by appealing to bureaucratic process or claiming cost issues. Increasingly, I've also observed an institutional deferral to automated access. So instead of paying for CART, which is real-time transcription provided by a human, university offices strongly urge using automated closed captions via platforms like Zoom, which we're doing right now, or Otter AI or Google Meet. And when the pandemic shutdowns began in 2020, and institutions faced increased demand for CART and ASL services, my university's IT office made the bombastic claim that auto captions are 99% accurate. One of my departments keeps switching CART providers every meeting, claiming that they aren't accurate enough and has told me they think that auto captions will be better for me. I have felt, personally and professionally, a high degree of frustration. First, those making determinations of accuracy are generally not themselves regular users of transcription services, nor are they the ones receiving the disability accommodation in question. I'm routinely reminded of Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke's work here, and Burke is B-U-R-K-E. In particular, her repeated contention that communication access depends on relation. I can't talk to Otter AI. I can't talk to Zoom's automated captions. I can't give these platforms a list of keywords or academic jargon or scholars' names. While Zoom is certainly learning, its learning is not specific to me as an individual, and it doesn't develop rapport with me over the course of a semester like a CART provider does. Whereas Zoom's accuracy hinges on word level recognition, a CART provider's accuracy hinges on communicative context. Given the speed of user speech, word for word accuracy is an impossibility, but I can be more assured that I'm getting the gist of a conversation when there's a human provider who's also assessing the context and the meaning and the feeling of what's going on in the room. So my question and where I want to leave us, where does my critique of automated access tools blur into the ableist rhetoric surrounding neurodivergent people? I'm struck in particular by my repeated deferral to relation and context here, which are also terms often used to proclaim autistic people's supposed impairments in perspective taking. Of course, Zoom's auto captions are not ChatGPT, but some of these finer points still hold here. In decrying the real violences rendered by automation, natural language processing, and algorithmic bias, where do we blur our critiques of the robotic with our critiques of the disabled? Where do our valuations of particular kinds of bodies and minds bleed into our digital desires? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Remy. As with Jasmine, a lot to talk about and to discuss together in all the time that we have left. So our structure, as we thought, is that we'll be asking, Caitlin and I will be asking Jasmine and Remy some questions for the next half an hour approximately, and then we'll open it up for the audience questions. So if you want to start adding your questions on the Q&A, we'll take a look as we move forward. So I will begin with one question that Caitlin and I have been thinking that speaks very well to some of the things that both of you have been talking about and have been mentioning. And specifically, we would like to focus a little bit more on the institutional barriers. So the question that we have for you two is, how do you navigate institutional barriers to both digital and physical accessibility when thinking about digital scholarship services or new research labs or initiatives? And you have mentioned a lot in your brief remarks.
I'm happy to answer first. So there's a couple of things. One, I think it's perfectly fine to be kind of fair to yourself if you don't have a lot of support. And I think you're gonna have to, if you're just getting started, scale your learning to kind of familiarize yourself with accessibility and accessible tools. But there are increasing efforts to provide audits and introductions to tools that look at their accessibility. So first and foremost is obviously accessible tools. If you're doing just a project, if you are establishing an initiative or a department, you're going to want to hire for that expertise or ensure that you have a connection with your university's central to your university central accessibility department. Those departments are oftentimes understaffed and overworked as well. So trying to write in for an accessibility specialist or support person is always a good idea. And to be quite blunt, that's going to be the easiest. If you're going to hire two people, at least make sure one has a grasp on it and the other person is a bit more, subject expertise. But I know for myself, Temple University has a central technology review committee, exception request committee. I actually serve on that committee. So technology requests, purchase requests go through that department. We audit them, and then we, ensure that they either have appropriate accommodations, tell them that they need to talk to the vendor or find an alternative or reject it. So if you can find a committee or initiative like that on your campus, that's also a really good way to learn. So I will say learning, checking tools so that you can use that are accessible, as well as making sure your publishing platforms are also accessible. And if you're hiring and you have some authority over that, do try to make sure you account for somebody with accessibility expertise, not just technology expertise.
I think this is Remy speaking. I'll just echo Jasmine, what you were noting in terms of really thinking concretely about expertise and what it means. And I think especially in the context of project-based work, in disability spaces, there's frequently this emphasis on avoiding retrofitting. Like retrofitting is kind of an, oh shit, we forgot about you ideology, right? Like it's design after the fact, it's the thing you do at the last minute. And I really appreciate the way that Amy Hamrai, whose last name is Hamraie, thinks about retrofitting as sort of the failure to imagine the existence of certain bodies and minds. And so what this means is always trying to design from inception, like from the very get-go, thinking about questions around accessibility, again, rather than staving it off until the end. I think that this question gets really tricky. Like I want to respond in 50 million different ways, because I think all of us are at institutions that just do not value this kind of work and do not generally value the embodied insights that disabled folks bring to institutions, right? Like disability is largely seen as a cost, as a burden, as an impediment, as something to avoid. I'm always struck by how often in like institutions' DEI statements, when they're trying to reference disability, they use the word ability rather than disability, right? It's people of all abilities. So they're still just trying to avoid like disability, even as a conceptual framework. And so I think part of the challenge, as you were saying, Jasmine, in your talk, is that like, I really appreciated how you noted something to the effect of like doing a one-off thing isn't going to solve the infrastructural problem, right? Like it's not a checklist. You can't just be one and done. It's constant iterative work. Annika Conrad, Konrad, refers to this as access fatigue, where the labor really is never ending and it often is disproportionately placed on certain people within the institution. So in saying all of that, like really depressing stuff, I think maybe I'll end on a positive note, which is trying to find people, like find people who are interested in accessibility, finding disabled community within your institution. Because I think the other thing in terms of how these accessibility services and disability service provision works at universities is to try and separate people or to make it seem like it's an individual problem here in this pocket, an individual problem here in that pocket.
Thank you. And building on what you were just saying and the idea of retrofitting, why do you think that digital accessibility is often forgotten or deprioritized or underestimated when people create projects or even when they are designing courses?
I guess to keep it lighter. I mean, if we're being fair, basic usability isn't always even taken into account when you're kind of guerrilla style building your own project. That's not the kind of thing. You're just trying to kind of publish your research or get a tool to do a certain thing. That's not you're building for yourself in essence, not for other people. And in reality, unless you're really trained to do otherwise, we're all building for ourselves. We're all designing things the way we would like them. And whether if you're not, you know, thinking about, or if you're not used to building for the audiences, and like, I'm gonna say something I say and people always look at me funny. I love bureaucracy for this reason to some degree, a little bit. I get a bit of, I do. Because while it's often misused, like, let's be fair, the function of like administrative processes is you shouldn't be doing that. You know, you shouldn't manage OSHA stuff if you don't specialize in safety. You know, like, what are you gonna do? What would I do if somebody like climbed up a ladder inappropriately and fell off and injured themselves? I don't know. You know, I don't know what the law and things are for that. This is where we get into structural problems. I often tell people, like, please do not blame yourself individually. If you were taught in school, if your job didn't give you training, if they're not providing you continuous training and like funding you to go and learn these skills, how would you do so? I just did it guerrilla style. I just went around, joined working groups, learned web content accessibility guidelines, audited things, you know, all of those things, but like not everybody has that time. I get a pretty high amount of research time to help develop our services. That's not something all of my colleagues have equally either. So, and that's not a critique on my employer specifically, my department's newer, so it's expected that we do that. You know, reference is a more established set of services. So I do think that we have to make sure that we are like being fair to ourselves and being realistic about what we can and cannot do and holding the appropriate people accountable while doing our best to mitigate harm, right? That's like all things. Sorry, that got really broad, but
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot, like in terms of this question of why digital accessibility is often forgotten, and I think it's just not taught, and access pervades everything we do, right? Like it's a consideration that like should be animating all facets of our lives, but even really simple things like when I teach disability studies classes, I often have to work with students to relearn how to use word processing, because just even something simple like using heading structures, thinking about styles within the document, it's not how they've learned, how many of us, most of us have learned how to use word processing, but make a real difference in terms of accessible document design. And then I think, as you know, as Jasmine, as you were noting, like the lack of time, how much work it can take. Like this is not something that one person can do. Like accessibility should be interdependent, right? Like it should not be the job of one person to manage, but something that we all share as an act of care for one another, right? Like it should be a mutual endeavor and a value and a practice and not an end state. I think it's also often forgotten or deprioritized because, so one way I often think about this is sometimes the tools that we might want to use to make something more accessible are in themselves not accessible. So what happens if you're trying to do a digital project and to create something accessible, but the very tool that you're using to do that is not compliant, is not accessible at all? And there's like a running joke in disability spaces around like digital platforms, you know, where like a company will say something like, we look forward to releasing our accessible version in the year 2037, right? Like, you know, full on decade from now. And so like this becomes a really recurrent problem. And given how quickly platforms change, the things we use change, it's just a kind of never ending game of whack-a-mole in some ways.
I'd also kind of like to add, we don't reward accessibility. Accessibility requires moving somewhat slowly. And that's just not, I mean, I talk about this in the context of higher education, right? If you're faculty, you have to publish all the time. You've got to get your research out. If you're doing digital humanities, you got to get out there. And that's not going to leave room for you to think about accessibility in a meaningful way, as opposed to in a secondary way that's preventing you from getting your publishing out. Same thing goes for like those of us who are in staff positions at universities, whether that be libraries or other departments. You know, we need to increase enrollment fast. We need to get student services fast. We need to do all these things fast, and those things cost money. And the slower something goes, the more money it costs. Let's be clear, especially if you want it to be sustainable. So, I mean, if we're being really just pragmatic and straightforward about it, there's not really a reward, the cost balance, because like notably disabled students are a minority. You could technically serve those who aren't and exclude those minus legal repercussions and still more or less see a benefit, right? But that's if we reduce humans down to like a cost benefit analysis, as opposed to thinking about, which is why I said in my slide, it's a human right. This is a civil rights issue. This isn't something that we need to like boil down to numbers. This is something you have to remember like fundamentally as like a human rights issue.
Thank you so much. I think this leads us really nicely into our next question, which is, why is accessibility and disability rights and disability studies so important to doing research in the humanities? Just to take it out a little bit further than just digital humanities, but humanities as a discipline, how does thinking about accessibility, teaching accessibility, researching accessibility, along with disability studies and disability rights, enhance or like add to humanities discipline as we conceive of it now?
I can start there if that sounds good. So I think this is a really good question, and I feel like part of me just wants to say because it is, which is not a very good or sufficient answer. But I think a lot about the kinds of models that dominate the way that disability is discussed. And, you know, there's a way in which kind of a deficit model often predominates conversations on disability. And that leaches its way into all kinds of discourse and scholarship. And I think a lot, I mean, for me right now, it's really apparent in all of the, you know, recent and newest spate of anti-trans discourse, whether online or legislatively speaking, because disability is so tightly enmeshed in all of that discourse. And so to like ignore that fact allows like this discourse to proliferate in really, really harmful ways. But it also means that some of the most vulnerable people are being attacked like on all sides of the equation, and lives are at stake. I feel like I try to avoid like clinical autism spaces now. I feel like I spent too much time in my early career like trying to infiltrate those spaces. And I think humanists really do need to infiltrate those clinical spaces, because we still have debates in certain disciplines about whether certain disabled people are actually fully human or not. There's a tendency in those spaces to have no disabled people represented at all within them. And so that really dictates the course that research takes. And then there's this lack of ethical consideration in terms of the kind of research that's going to be done, supposedly in the name of a group of people who need to be fixed, cured, or helped. I feel like I could keep ranting, so I'm going to stop myself. But I think the ethical dimensions really stand out to me.
I am going to come at this from the concept of, we intellectually hear a lot about like questioning the canon and the idea of, you know, intellectual rigor, when how intellectually rigorous can you truly be when you are really examining these same concepts and ideas from the same narrow perspectives. But I don't think people fully realize how different the perspective is when you take into account disability. Like I remember I read a whole book on the concept of melancholy and the history of melancholy, and it's just clinical depression, you know. They're like, she was just always so sad, she's clinically depressed. And let's get into like beyond that. I don't mean that even from like an ethical or whatever, but I'm saying like really think about how does clinical depression in the 19th century, when things move slower, wealth, the disparity of someone's upper middle class, how does that look different from today where you have to work? Capitalism is a different, and that's like, those are the kinds of ideas that you don't really have. Like if you've never experienced or worked with somebody or don't have a study or understanding of what clinical depression functionally is, how you see the world, and how that could change your scholarship in literature, for example. There's this idea that we get into, if we're just talking, like I said, scholarship and intellectual and humanities and the digital humanities by extension, there are really unique ways of viewing the world that functionally are so different. I say it all the time. I had to actually explain to somebody with ADHD, where I was like, it's not that you forget, the thing functionally disappears. If I put my glass down and walk away from it, the thing doesn't exist. I don't know how to explain it to people. I'm like, it's just gone. It's over. I'm never finding that. I'm not going to find that glass until like the end of the day or something. And while that sounds like tragic to somebody, it's actually also a functional way of viewing the world and assessing the art, the humanities that are being produced. And it really opens the ground for the humanities to progress in ways that maybe have not happened due to all these things like decolonial. That's what I mean. Functionally, we talk about decolonializing your syllabus and questioning the canon and all these things. And I think disability is also a really important frame and lens through which to view all of that. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really important aspect to bring into this. And I know that we talked about, both of you kind of alluded to this earlier. I'm sorry, there's a chair stuck in my face. Alluded to this earlier. But we see more and more digital humanities and digital scholarship broadly, faculty members and instructors engaging with digital pedagogy and bringing DS projects into the classroom. And so what Marisol and I were wondering is, how do accommodations and needs of students change when they transition from maybe like visitors or users of a digital project to creators of a digital project? For example, the accessibility of using a tool rather than a visitor to a digital project, what sort of things change for them? I think often we kind of think about accessibility only as the person coming to the project to visit, but what does it mean to make a project accessible to make, especially in a classroom? And I know, Jasmine, you thought a lot about this with virtual reality, so I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
So part of my job, even unofficially, but officially at this point, is I do consultations with faculty to come up with accommodations for their students, and also to think about how to structure their assignments and having those students integrate and use those technologies as well. And it does change quite a bit. Like you said, aside from just now having to think about the production software in essence being accessible, the kinds of ideas and questions that students have may vary, as well as so how a student with disabilities plays a video game, for example, when they have specialized controller, or when they have to turn the sound off and play it without sound, or if they are more reliant on haptic hardware, that can really change the design mechanism of if they develop the game themselves. They may use color differently. They may use new game design mechanics. They may have different scoring systems. The unique forms of gameplay that come out. And once again, using an example, there were a series of games that focused on clinical depression in like the early 2010s probably, that focused on slowness and other kinds of decision-making and player mechanics that are different, that offer up a different mode of gameplay for other people. And so the way that students, and I want to be clear about this from a mechanical standpoint, if a student looks to build a feature that isn't supported by the software, so not just the software being inaccessible, but the software only being designed for a certain type of game mechanic, for example, that can happen as well. That can be a problem. And so it highlights, and I'm sorry, the Q&A question has been brought up, but it highlights some of the structural inabilities, or like the software, the tools being used to produce these things as them being like inherently incapable of supporting beyond just like accessibility, the design aspirations of some of the students. That's like one way. I'm sure Remy has others.
Yeah. In thinking about this question, I mean, like, there's just always an inherent limitation in tools which don't provide access options, both at the level of production, but then also at the level of just what you were saying, like what students want to produce and actually create, and getting it to do that. And I feel like often the suggestions on the part of instructors also aren't themselves fully realistic. And a number of folks in disability studies have talked about this, but the demand for flexibility on some level, right? Like, it's important. It's a tenet of universal design, and we can critique universal design. And I actually do want to critique universal design, but like flexibility can be like a useful option. But then the question becomes like, where does the burden of flexibility fall? And then what kinds of body minds are we imagining on the part of instructors in order to take on the endless job of flexibility, which, like, being flexible is presumed to be this never-ending state where you just kind of have to keep making things happen, keep making things happen. So that becomes a very real problem, especially absent institutional support or infrastructure. When thinking about the complexities of digital projects, I feel like one suggestion I have is like, build relationships with people at your institution, specifically in, however your institution is configured, your disability services office, the ADA office, your teaching and learning office, right? Like, people live at different places depending on how your institution is configured. But there's a way in which, like, if you can think about this as communal and as constantly subject to failure, and also building in this reflective component, like, these are the problems with the tools. Like, this is a problem with the mindset of inaccessibility being a structuring logic, or the presumption that certain bodies and minds are valued, organizes a lot of the things that we are doing and creating. And I mean, arguably, like, even the stuff that we're just doing in text in Word documents is very, very inaccessible, and is not actually considering the diverse needs of the students and the knowledges and experiences that they bring. So I think also thinking about how all of our modes of composition, however low threshold, are tightly interwoven within this problematic becomes really important. I think the other thing that I'll note, so a frequent assignment that you see in a lot of different spaces, sometimes it's in disability studies classes, and sometimes it might be in like a computer science class, is what's called an accessibility audit. So that essentially involves getting students to engage with the process of trying to figure out how and where something is accessible or inaccessible. So this could be done virtually or physically. There are variations on this in disability study spaces where it becomes less about like the checklist motif, like, oh, okay, there's a large font, checked that off, or, oh, okay, this imagined a wheelchair user, checked off that box, or, right, like, but instead to think about some of the sort of critical cultural questions around ideologies of the space, virtual or physical. And to also dig deeper into some of the histories or construction of the space. Caitlin, you might know this better than me, but I'm just remembering having had students who went on to become librarians at U of M in classes mentioning that parts of Hatcher, our graduate library, are wrought in iron, which is why certain floors of the stacks are not accessible via the elevators, right? And so, like, yeah.
Our institution's libraries are, speaking physically in this point, are very inaccessible. There are ramps that not even book carts can go up, so it's not even conducive to the work of the library. Don't know why they're built that way. I was once given the accessibility plan for our largest entertainment space in Hatcher Graduate Library, and it was like a treasure map. There was an axe that you to go in and out of the stacks, which are very old and very narrow, and they were measured, and they will fit a sort of standard wheelchair size was the language I was given, which is makes them just barely compliant with the ADA. But I was like, what if you don't have a standard like wheelchair size? What if you have one that's wider? What if you have a wheelchair and you have a service animal who's technically supposed to like walk just ahead of you or beside you because they're supposed to be an extension of your body, but like they can't because the stacks aren't wide enough. And then you're forced to, you know, reconfigure the way you're supposed to work, like move through the world. You have to reconfigure just to go through a library stacks. So like, I think this actually leads us really nicely into one last question that I think Marisol is going to add.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. And exactly, that's what I was thinking, that what you just said, it's a great segue for our last question before we move to the Q&A portion. And we, just as a reminder, we really encourage people in the audience to post your questions on the Q&A so our speakers can think about them. So our last question is, digital accessibility, as you said, continuously requires a lot of intentional and thoughtful labor that can seem overwhelming. And as you, Remy, said, even that burden of flexibility when first introduced. How do you both incorporate planning for digital accessibility in your own research in digital accessibility and disability studies?
So first and foremost, this kind of covers a broad number of things we've talked about, but when you don't want to think about it at the point that you need it, you want to constantly be advocating for it at all times. So that way, by the time you actually need it, there's some precedent and people have been thinking about it. And in that, what I mean is, even flexibility in instruction, you can't do that if you're teaching like 50 students, you know, you got to get grades in. There's things, you know, and I do think that when we push back against, in universities in particular, we talk about like the rise of MBAs running universities, and we talk about how that, I say it all the time, you'll hear like, oh, instruction, but nobody's ever discussing pedagogy at a higher level. They're not saying like, what are the quality of the classes like? What are, you know, that's really the issue with universal design as well. Like who's even if universities wanted to claim they're implementing it, how, with who, you know. And when we talk about faculty advocating for hires, when we talk about advocating for changes in the way we do things, there has to be this advocacy for like for efficacy, not just doing things. And that goes for a departmental level, that goes on an individual level as you're building your projects. You don't want to like suddenly discover, and I think anybody inaccessible who works and focuses on accessibility knows this feeling when you discover an inaccessible tool, but it's a crucial tool that's very popular that everybody wants to use. And you have to get ready for that hard conversation. And it is less hard if you culturally normalize accessibility as a conversation. But oftentimes when you bring it up, it's like more of an HR discussion rather than like a real discussion. Like you bring it up and they go, oh, now we have to think about this. And they're thinking, what can we do without getting sued? As opposed to saying like, I understand that we may have to find workarounds. Doesn't mean we can't use this tool. We just have to reassess how we're using this tool and all of that. And that's really what you want to try to build before you even get to the point. Like I know this is aspirational, but in a department, it helps to get used to having these conversations in advance before you need it specifically for yourself. Normalize having those kinds of conversations with people where people don't get defensive and people understand that this is not saying you can't use this, you've all failed, and saying like we need to just assess how we're using this technology and in what situations, and you know who can, and I often say to faculty, if in the worst case scenario, make it so that students don't have to use this to pass the class. That's the bare minimum. Make sure they have an alternative, and that helps bring faculty's like stress levels down a little bit because they're overworked and have a lot of students and they don't want to hear like, now I have to make this whole new software develop. I'm like, just make it so that they have alternatives. And establishing that cultural norm makes things a lot easier when you go to build your own projects and you need to go and tell somebody that things are a problem. There's an issue.
In thinking about this question, I think I'm still stuck on universal design and why it's fantastic. So like there are so many different problems with universal design, but one is that it's become a very shiny euphemism that I think is attractive to institutions. And what ends up happening is, right, like the whole idea of universal design is you try to meet the needs of as many people as possible, but in practice that often results in you're just meeting the needs of some, vague majority, and somehow like disability and unique experiences like get cast out from that. It also quickly turns into a checklist motif and weirdly becomes curative, right? Like in many ways, the whole idea behind universal design is to try and eradicate disability, or to try and like withhold it from view. I think a lot about the pandemic shutdown in this way. So prior to COVID, disabled and chronically ill folks were frequently asking for remote learning and remote work accommodations, and were told, by their institutions, we can't do this. Sorry, we don't have the infrastructure. And then suddenly institutions were able to do it in a pinch when everybody needed to do it. And then when institutions decided COVID is over, which it's not, suddenly, nope, we can't do that anymore. We don't have the infrastructure, right? So it was universal design when it affected everybody, but now that it's just a problem of, disabled and chronically ill folks again, sorry. So I think, I don't know, thinking about that allows my rage to come out. And I think, I realize the question is about incorporating planning. But sometimes I think rage is part of the planning here. And also I think working with students to understand how, where, and why that rage is grounded. One of the things I try to do, which is really challenging and fraught with students, is to think about access as interdependent. And so trying to move away from the notion of flexibility and instead to like, we're all kind of needing each other in some ways, and we're going to have to like make changes, or we're going to have moments of utter failure as we're trying to attempt these things. But to give examples of kinds of tasks or projects where I think like really thoughtfully attending to disability nuances and productively enriches things. So closed captioning practices. I think engaging students with even some of the automated access tools that are available and the particular problematics of that, but then also thinking rhetorically about the practice of something like closed captioning. And there are a number of scholars who draw our attention to this, like all of the thought work and decision-making that needs to go into creating a successful closed caption. And many students are themselves users of closed captions. So they already are bringing a wealth of knowledge in terms of what works and what's terrible, like how closed captions can actually spoil a scene in a TV show by introducing a character or a premise that hasn't yet been visually introduced, or what happens when like people aren't artfully named, or the problem of sound effects, right? All of these really interesting questions. I think in generating activities like producing closed captions, ultimately, not all students can produce closed captions because like transcribing audio relies on certain sensory apparatuses that not all of us share, right? And so thinking about like, how do we collaboratively endeavor together on those assignments? Everybody can play a specific role in thinking about the complexity of something like closed captions that doesn't just have to translate as sit down and transcribe. So yeah, I don't know if I exactly responded to the question. I think I went in 20 different directions, but those are some of my thoughts at the moment.
Those were the best directions, Remy. We really appreciated the path that you chose to take. It was enlightening. We do have some questions from our audience, and I think we're gonna use this time to transition to the audience Q&A. Our first question comes from Heather Froelich, who says, Remy mentioned this, but I'd like to expand. Many of our digital scholarship platforms and tools are not accessible. This includes things like Gephi, OpenRefine. What are some ways practitioners can highlight these issues and account for diverse needs when adopting them?
Okay, so this is also why you need to have accessibility staff. There's only but so much you can do with inaccessible technologies. You do need to be able to actually advocate with the vendor or the developer of said technology, which is the first and primary thing you should do, is ask people to fix, ask the people who built it to fix it. That's a lot of work, let's be fair. That's convincing vendors who oftentimes, like, especially with like small companies, when it's like one developer, it may not even be a vendor, right? You may be using some open source software that a random small group of people on grant funding built. Is not, they don't necessarily have the resources to fix it either. The easiest way is to find other staff and work with the vendor to do that kind of work, to get grant funding to help them with that, or to provide free reports on our audits to tell them what features need to be built, or other things like that. That advocacy is modeled by like the Big Ten, who have a whole consortium for that. So that's just like the, how do you fix it answer. What to do about that to help students? Oftentimes you're going to have to just handle the fires as they light up. If you come across a student who can't use it and needs to do it, like sometimes I say just make it a group project so the student has someone who can use it. And that advocacy comes from recording those problems, making sure that those who you report to or who can do something about it know that those things are happening and know that those issues occur. Like I said before, it doesn't have to be a panic. It doesn't have to be like, we have to throw the whole software away, especially when it's the only option. Sometimes it's just, let's find a creative way to look at how we use this so that we're not excluding people. And let's just do our best to, and this comes when I was talking about guidelines and adoption. This is actually what I mean. Guidelines are only formed when a bunch of people use the software and then come together and create guidelines based off of their shared use cases. If you're using an obscure software that not that many people use, that makes it increasingly difficult to get people to come together and fix a problem because it's like one person or like a few hundred people. And so there are going to be cases where a certain software are never going to be fixed if they're not broadly adopted and used all the time. So it sounds counterproductive, but sometimes all you can do is keep using the software and providing use cases and justifications for why things should be fixed with it, and advocating for broader use. I hope that logic makes sense. I'm like, yeah, just use the inaccessible software and hope that they fix it, but that's not what I mean. I mean, it's going to have to, adoption facilitates improvement and usability.
I think, Jasmine, I especially want to echo what you were noting about collaboration, like collaborative projects as being one way of not just sort of like, not just being able to adopt an accessible software platform, but I think to integrate some of these conversations into the larger fabric of the class. And it, I think, enables you to think more complexly about the kinds of roles that student can play in the production of a digital project. And in some ways, like I feel as though scholarship and technical communication and pedagogy and technical communication is really rich and potentially helpful here. Students can be project managers, students can be captioners, students can be, right? Like you can think about all the variety of roles that might take place as a larger part of a digital ecosystem in digital project management and creation. I think also, Jasmine, just kind of repeating and echoing everything you're saying about, to the extent that you can, contacting and recontacting vendors, and also to the extent that you can, getting accessibility staff at your institution involved, getting institutional players to also put together those use cases. Sometimes things improve, sometimes they don't. And then I would also just say, in the event that the software platform isn't the only availability, right, like there's another option, discarding that, but still not dropping it entirely, right? Because I think it's really important to put that pressure on platforms to actually do the work and the labor of accessibility. Because again, this is another example, right, where it just kind of keeps falling down to the individual level.
Thank you. And we do have other question from Julia Flanders. I will read it out loud. I would like to hear more about potential critiques of ChatGPT and large language models that are indebted to the kinds of problematic definitions of human characteristics that Remy outlined. Can critiques of large language models center the human without reifying obsolete, problematic definitions of that concept? Or are there other angles of critique that are more successful, critical, tenable, or ethical?
So, Julia, I am thinking hard about your question and knowing that I'm not going to have a satisfactory answer. I do think there are ways of doing this without reifying the problematic concept of the human, because, you know, there are lots of problems with going that route, right? Like it's, you know, in trying to defer to like, no, this group of people is human. There's always going to be another group of people who is not. And then there's like the human centricity of it all, as though like humans are like where our focus needs to be all the time, without regard for broader kinds of relations and ways of thinking about being in the world. I think to me, the humanness part keeps cropping up again and again because it's so tightly linked to discourse around AI, but also neurodivergence. And so I feel like it's a strand that needs to be pulled at, but it also is a strand where one could go in yet another dangerous direction in trying to proffer a critique. And I think that that's where I struggle a bit in terms of the question of automation and access. So, you know, there's just, as I had mentioned, this propensity on the part of institutions, instead of doing access labor themselves or hiring providers to do access labor, it's the turn to machines, which, you know, in the case of automated captions, like a lot of people jokingly refer to them as craptions. Or you know, caption fails, right? There are certain things that automated captions cannot quite do. And yet I feel resistant in fully going all the way of that critique and suggesting, well, a human provider can provide context, because it brings up this whole thorny morass of like, what are we valuing and devaluing in terms of expression, communication, and how and where is our critique of the mechanical also like a providing or reinforcing really terrible stereotypes about disabled and other marginalized people. So that's where I'm kind of left, is in the sticky mess of it all. I hope maybe I've addressed it at least somewhat, and I don't know, Jasmine, if you have additional thoughts here too.
So I'm going to come at this from, I think, the specific perspective of my own cultural backgrounds and the way I thought of this. So to be clear, I'm African American. My mother's Indigenous Central American, Raccoona Indian. And there's a reason I bring this up, which is the idea of who is human for colonized people is a particularly intense question, but also the way we engage with life as an Indigenous person. My grandmother, the idea of responsibility and the, like you said, the kind of pushing back against human centricity is a big concept. I've been talking to people about ChatGPT, and I'm like, okay, let's like hypothetically say this. So let's get away from whose language is used to and educate these models, and let's hypothetically say it gains sentience. Let's hypothetically say that it becomes these things. Humans still shouldn't view it as a replacement for themselves, which I think is what a lot of people are doing. It is either an extension of our own consciousness, or it is just a different thing. Dogs are a different thing. They're not less or more. They are just a different thing. You know, birds are just a different thing. So it is not, and we don't live without them. We don't we can't survive without those things the same way. Like our existence is improved. It's a nuance, right? Like it's not always that those things serve us either directly. It's just our existence is affected by those things. And I think that when we critique ChatGPT and we critique its use of human, I think we also have to critique the way people perceive what, like I said, if the goal is sentience or whatever, if, what do we have to critique the way people perceive conceptually its role and what it is. Like I said, we talk about technology replacing us, but at some point we have to say, like, do we think about like a bird's competition for us for food? No, it's now its own existence that we have to engage with. And I think that we need to engage with it as, like I said, to critique what is this thing to us? How are humans perceiving ChatGPT? And how does that inform the inappropriate use of some language or descriptions of it? And that's like a really broad philosophical question. That's just like, but for me, that's how I engage with it. I'm like, if this becomes sentient, I don't have to think of it as a human. It's its own thing, and I should think to understand it rather than try to make it fit into my understanding. I don't try to comprehend how a bird sees the world. I'm sorry, that's not how my brain works. I just have to comprehend, but I do try to comprehend what its role is and how I interact with it to some degree.
It's okay. I might quickly follow up because my brain keeps going in yet more different directions. Thanks, Jasmine. There's a really long and rich sort of, like, in thinking about disability culture and autistic culture in particular, like a disavowal of the human, right? And an emphasis on relation with one's surrounds. And there's a really well-known video that is probably nearly a couple decades old now by Mel Baggs, last name Baggs, called In My Own Language. And one of the things that Baggs is trying to display is more or less like, she begins the video by essentially trying to narrate what she's doing in terms of prototypical autistic symptoms, right? Like how a clinician might regard an autistic person's movement with their environment, so like Baggs is like running their hands under the water or like rubbing like a furry thing against their face. And then the video is re-narrated by saying like, no, this is like autistic perception, and this might mean something. It doesn't mean anything at all. This is how I am interacting and relating with my environment, and it's not meaningful in the way that you're thinking, and maybe it's not meaningful at all. And so there's just this real emphasis on like engagement with the surround, like it's not human-centric. And so clinicians have often latched on that to say that neurodivergent people are essentially robots or automatons or whatever else. But then there's a very real big part of autistic culture that embraces that as well, right? And so I think that part and that point is really particularly important. Oh yeah, thanks, Jasmine. You're just making me think of all of these things.
We have a few more minutes in the keynote, and so if you have any questions for Jasmine or Remy, please pop them in the Q&A. And no worries if you don't. Marisol and I have a bank of backup questions just in case people are still digesting the talks.
I do want to just compare it, just building off of what Remy said as well. I call it the cut fruit discussion, where like that you see pictures of pre-peeled oranges and people go, who needs this? Somebody, disabled people, but somebody needs it. People who are arthritic, who can't peel oranges very effectively. I think the question that extends to ChatGPT, what it is and who it's for is going to change. It's going to change person by person. And I think that we should shift our critiques, not all of our critiques. I think we need to critique and analyze who it's for, who's using it. And we talk about this to some degree where we're like, some people are using it for this, and some people are using it for this. But I do think that when we critique it specifically, like I said, shifting away from like, this is a threat, or this, or even this is a replacement, or this is whatever, and kind of moving away from assumptions altogether, and just purely being like, what is, this person's rubbing a fuzzy thing on their face. It doesn't have to be, but stopping to say, like, instead of projecting onto it, trying our best to kind of think of all the different, like as Remy suggested, ways of being and ways of viewing, which I think is a much more interesting way of maybe critiquing and engaging with this whole idea. Maybe. Okay. I'm not a philosopher. I don't, that's not my area of like existence and being and humanity. That's not my area of expertise. But the concept of existentialism in race theory and race studies is a big thing. So that's more so once again where I'm kind of, and cultural background coming from with it.
I don't know, Marisol, I feel like that aligns really nicely with one of our questions, our extra questions. And what are some ways that to add on to this question with some things that Jasmine said, what are some ways that physical and digital accessibility intersect, but also how does accessibility and disabilities intersect with race, gender, gender identity, sexuality as well?
I'd also just like to say, sorry, I'll leave it for Remy, but the same thing goes for accessibility. Is what I said, as opposed to saying, how do we make it so that disabled people can use this thing in the exact same way I'm using it? Saying, how do I fundamentally change this thing so that it is used better or used differently, or that it meets the needs of actually voiced by those populations, or that it actually serves a different purpose. We don't need 50,000 versions of the same mapping software with fancier or varying features necessarily, but it would be great to have software that actually fundamentally does something unique with the same data, right? And that's the idea of accessibility. It's not always just like, make this usable for everybody. And sometimes it is, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it is also, what can we fundamentally innovate, which sometimes is lost in like a hyper-capitalistic society where you're just trying to get a piece of a pie early on, like an MLM. You're like, you gotta get in early so that you get your piece of the pie there. But yes. And that goes for all, like you said, gender, race, the idea that just opening the door doesn't bring in diverse voices to the table,
Yeah, with this question, I'm thinking a lot both about assistive and augmentative communication, as well as closed captions, and the limitations of those tools, and also the the ways in which those tools make stark decisions around race, gender, accent, language, and nationality. So with AAC in particular, like assistive and augmentative communication ranges from like physical analog tools like flashcards and picture books, and other sorts of analog communication tools, all the way to, sophisticated apps that you might have on a Dynavox or an iPad for communication. And often these tools are used for people whose primary mode of communicating is not speaking, right? So we're thinking like text to communication systems, picture communication systems. And these tools are really fraught because their vocabularies can be limited both by the platform, but also the third-party intermediary, whether that's a parent or behavioral therapist or an educator. So it means that like Black users of the platforms may not have access to vocabularies and voices that are distinctly feeling like their own, or there might be limitations. Like a really commonly remarked upon thing is that these vocabularies are very child-centric. So like you can't talk about sex or bodily autonomy with them, right? And so there's a way in which the communication practices of disabled folks is constrained, often along racial lines and sexuality lines. And then with closed captions, especially automated captions, like these tools privilege specific voices and ways of speaking. So if you are a white cis male person with a Midwestern US accent, you're going to be picked up great. If you're anybody else, it's going to be like distinct gradations of not being picked up at all or great. So that not only impedes your communicative representation, but then also for folks who are dependent on captions and automated tools for understanding, right? Like it's just not going to work or translate. So I think, Caitlin, maybe that bridges the physical and digital questions. But I mean, they're really huge problems for communication access, right? And it means that whole segments of people are not actually getting those needs met.
And I think that's a wonderful place to end our keynote, and to thank Jasmine and Remy. And I think we're gonna hand it off to Pam and Liz to end our session.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Wow, that was just such a inspiring and phenomenal and embodied and emotional conversation. And I really appreciate the way that you turned a critical lens and problematized the tools of our everyday pandemic life. And really, there's so much to process and to think about how we can take what we've learned today into our daily practices. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Liz to make the final remarks.
My final remarks are mostly gratitude. Thank you to our speakers, Jasmine and Remy. Thank you to our moderators, Marisol and Caitlin. Thank you to our interpreters today, Kayla and Allison. I don't know where we would be without you. You are amazing. And thank you to the ACH Conference Committee, our leadership, and our entire community. Thank you out there for spending time with us today, especially because we know that time is precious. We acknowledge that. And we also acknowledge that time might be a construct, but whatever time is, thank you for being with us today. We hope to see you in the ACH General Membership Meeting that will begin in about 15 minutes at 1:45 p.m. Eastern, 10:45 a.m. Pacific. We'll see you in the next 3 days. Thank you all.